Welcome to Volume 2 of our study on the Book of Romans. The Book of Romans is Paul's most extensive gospel presentation, and the gospel is the good news. So you may have heard the gospel over and over again, or you may be brand new to it. But either way, if someone asked you the question, what is the gospel? Could you tell them? See, Paul actually explains the gospel to believers, and the truth is that believers need the gospel. It transforms us as we are sanctified throughout the course of our lives. We don't just need it at the moment of our salvation. We need the gospel for all of life. And so let's take a look at some background to this book of Romans. The author of this book is the Apostle Paul. And Paul, before becoming a Christian, was a Pharisee, a Jewish religious leader, and he believed that he was righteous because of his heritage as a Jew and because he adhered to the law. But Paul also persecuted and killed Christians for their belief. And Acts 9 gives us this account of how Jesus met Paul on the road, the risen Christ, on his way to Damascus, and on his way to the place where he was planning on arresting Christians. And Paul experiences in this moment a radical conversion experience. And after this, he begins preaching the gospel. And this is the same gospel that he was persecuting Christians for preaching. And so Paul might not seem like a very likely person to be writing this book that tells the gospel message. But Paul is the perfect person to write this book because he has experienced firsthand the transformational power of the gospel that he preaches. And so it was written probably around 57 AD from the city of Corinth, and it was written to the church in Rome. And so this church was a mix of Jewish and Gentile believers. And so it's no wonder that Paul emphasizes the gospel for both the Jew and the Gentile. The genre of this book is an epistle, which is a letter sent by an apostle. And the purpose of this letter is to explain the gospel. You know, there may have been some tension between Jewish believers and Gentile believers. We can't be certain, but Paul does talk about the importance of unity in the gospel for the Jew and for the Gentile. And so the book of Romans can be broadly broken up into 3 sections. The first one, chapters 1 through 5, is Paul's presentation of the gospel. The second section is chapters 6 through 11, where Paul answers possible objections to the gospel. And the last section is chapters 12 through 16, where Paul gives application. Now that we know the gospel, how should we live in response? And if you'd like to see a more detailed overview of the book of Romans, you can look in your study book on page 193, where you can see the message of the book of Romans broken down in a more detailed way. So before we begin our study of the second half of the book of Romans, let's briefly recap what we learned in volume 1. So in the first half of Romans, Paul presented the gospel message. He began by proving that all people are born sinful. We cannot meet the righteous requirements of the law and are therefore subject to the wrath of God and face the wages of sin, which is death. But God sent his only Son to become a man, live a perfect and sinless life, and die on the cross in our place. And so when we put our faith in Christ and his work, he takes on our sin as his own on the cross, and we receive his righteousness that is imputed to us. And this gospel message is summed up in 2 verses, the thesis and theme of the book of Romans, Romans 1, 16 and 17. I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith. As it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. So after Paul explained the gospel message, he began to give objections to the gospel and to answer those objections. And he's going to actually continue that here in volume 2. And so we find ourselves now in Romans 8, a beautiful chapter of hope and encouragement in the assurance that we have in Christ. So let's begin our study on volume 2 of the book of Romans.